I rise to address the Justice and Other Legislation Amendment Bill 2023, and at the outset I want to focus on the other part of this bill. The other part, another omnibus bill that amends 30 acts, 4 regulations and repeals another act. It's become par for the course for this Labor state government to roll difficult or politically contentious issues in with unrelated routine matters. And, Deputy Speaker, that is not the practice of a government that's committed to transparency or to openness or to good government. It looks a lot, Deputy Speaker, like a government that's focused on the interests of their own rather than those of Queenslanders and of the Labor Party's political objectives rather than on governing for all Queenslanders. And, Deputy Speaker, we saw it last sitting when the government with no nose sought to bring in amendments to a bill dealing with the monitoring of sex offenders that would have probably had the support of all members, but with no consultation, no oversight. We see the government bringing in multiple amendments to a bill that should have been dealt with through an appropriate committee process and in a bill probably of its own standing. And no doubt, Deputy Speaker, we'll be back in here fixing the errors of those incompetent Labor ministers who have presided over that as a consequence. And, Deputy Speaker, it is just another sign of the rolling chaos and crisis on display by this Palaszczuk Labor government. Deputy Speaker, I want to start by indicating my support for the measures contained in this bill. And I've got to work on my poker face, sorry. Just going back to the bill, Deputy Speaker, I want to start on indicating my support for the measures contained in this bill to make the death of an unborn child an aggravating factor for certain prescribed offences like murder, dangerous operation of a motor vehicle causing death and assault occasioning actual bodily harm, among others. Deputy Speaker, the trauma that Peter and Sarah Milosevic have endured after their unborn daughter Sophie was killed as a result of the actions of a drug-affected driver have been immense. But I'm sure that I speak for parents right across Queensland in saying thank you to Peter and Sarah for never giving up the fight to ensure that should others find themselves in the same situation in the future, and unfortunately no doubt someone will, that those offenders who do the wrong thing will be correctly held to account for the pain and for the loss that they inflict. Deputy Speaker, I can only imagine how difficult the years since Sophie was taken have been, but Sophie's legacy will be a safer Queensland where those who inflict harm on an unborn child will be sentenced accordingly. And I congratulate the government for listening to the Milosevic's calls, albeit slowly, but I appreciate the government have brought it in. And on that note, I also want to pay tribute to my colleague, the member for Lockyer, Jim McDonald, who stood alongside Peter and Sarah during their long fight to have this sensible change implemented. And I acknowledge the member for Stretton's comments, commending the member for Lockyer for his contribution, and I want to stand alongside the member for Stretton's comments and also add my regards to associate myself with the contribution of the member for Lockyer earlier today. And I know that without Peter and Sarah's unstinting advocacy, supported by the member for Lockyer, this important and sensible change would not have been implemented. So, on behalf of my community of Buderim, I want to say thank you. Deputy Speaker, the bill also makes changes to the circumstances in which an adult defendant charged with a prescribed sexual offence can be identified. As we've heard, these changes bring Queensland into line with other states with the exception of the Northern Territory. And despite some of the contributions in submissions to the committee and some of the rhetoric that's been around this issue, there have been very few issues arising in other states that have already implemented this change. And I guess the fact that people already openly flaunt the requirement as it exists in Queensland and in many cases are unfortunately not held to account for doing so talks to the fact that community expectations have changed over the years and the legislation should move with that. The change also helps to improve public confidence in the administration of justice in Queensland, and I think it balances the needs to protect the rights of victims with the desire for greater transparency where people have been charged with a prescribed sexual offence, where adults have been charged with a prescribed sexual offence. And the issue with respect to identifying minors is a whole other issue again. As we've heard, this was an outcome of the Hear Her Voice report, and it's important that those changes are implemented in a timely and efficient manner. My LNP colleagues and I have supported the timely rollout of the Hear Her Voice recommendations, and I want to place on the record that it is disappointing that there is still considerable progress to be made in that regard. I also want to talk to the changes in relation to the Electoral Act. That boundaries are only going to need to be finalised 60 days before an election just creates more uncertainty. I acknowledge we now have a fixed date for state elections. That's a good thing. But moving the boundaries around 60 days out from election, I don't think that helps anyone. I experienced this myself in 2017 when I was a candidate in Buderim, and the proposed boundaries that the ECQ initially set down actually saw me taking them with probably the top half of the member for Kawarna's current electorate was in Buderim, and some 8 to... no comment. The changes actually saw some 7,000 to 8,000 people move. So when you're trying to campaign and you're trying to introduce yourself, it's probably not such an issue if you're an incumbent member, but for those who are seeking election for the first time, moving those boundaries 60 days out from election is a significant deterrent for those who are trying, or a significant detriment for those who are trying to get to know the issues in individual suburbs, get out and speak to people in those communities, only for those boundaries to move. I think that is a bad thing, and I think it creates uncertainty, and I'd like to see a greater requirement for the ECQ to finalise those boundaries in a timely way. I also want to address the issue with respect to postal votes, which the member for Warrego spoke about in detail, and I acknowledge her advocacy in relation to this issue since the 2020 election. That 57,000 postal votes were rejected at the 2020 election. It should be of concern. That 30% of those could have been saved had they not taken a course of action that this legislation will seek to address, but minor things like the fact that the postal vote was not in the sealed envelope, was in the outer envelope. It's just ridiculous in my view. There's plenty of seats in this House where the outcome was decided by thin margins. The member for Bundaberg is going to speak after me by the look of it. Nine votes. 9 votes in Bundaberg, 84 in Nicklin. I was there for the recount for both of them. Nearly got back 11 in Bundy, but only managed to get back 2. But the point is, Deputy Speaker, in both of those seats, the postal votes flowed to the LNP over Labor, and they were decided by very narrow margins. Very narrow margins. If I look at Bundaberg, 836 postal votes were rejected. 836. 30% of those could have been saved, according to the Electoral Commission, and that would have been the difference in Bundaberg. And we would have had a good local member advocating for issues in Bundaberg rather than a Labor hack, as we do right now. And in Nicklin, and I pay tribute to the former member for Nicklin and the future member for Nicklin, Marty Hunt, a tireless advocate for his community, a man who served his community, is a PCYC rep for 17 years, and then when he lost the last election, went back to serving his community as a police officer, as a school-based police officer at Nambour State College. That talks to his dedication for his community of Nicklin, of Nambour.
Order. Pause the clock,
the rejected
please.
Postal ballots.
Pause the clock. Member for Maryborough, you're not in your seat. If you want to interject, go back or be quiet. Member for Bundaberg. Member for Buderim.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. The rejected postal ballots in the seat of Nicklin, which Labor holds with a margin of 84 votes, was 654. So if 30% of those were not rejected, as they should not have been, and those preferences predominantly flowed to the LNP, which they did, we may very well have a good local member for Nicklin here in the form of Marty Hunt, rather than a head nodder and someone who hopefully will be washed out to sea in 14 months' time, metaphorically washed out to sea in 14 months' time.
Point of order, Speaker.
Pause the clock. Minister, what is your
Can I getting back to the title of the bill, long title of the bill and relevance? This is so not on what we're talking about today.
Thank you for your point of order. Member for Buderim, I understand you're talking about postal voting and the changes that have been made in the bill, but I do ask, please, perhaps you could move on to your next topic as well.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I appreciate your guidance, and I will move on to the next point. I think the point is, Deputy Speaker, that Queenslanders need confidence in the electoral system, and they don't have that right now in Queensland. They don't have that because they have seen a progressive whittling down of these provisions from the Palaszczuk Labor government. We saw it when they changed the voting system from optional preferential to compulsory preferential to suit their political outcomes. We've seen it time and time again, and Queenslanders don't have confidence, and that's a very unfortunate thing because it's important that Queenslanders do have confidence. And I'd call on the Electoral Commission to do a better job of administering elections in Queensland. I think it is unacceptable. I think it is unacceptable the manner in which some of these approaches have been taken. And it's very clear, had a different approach been taken prior to the last election, some of these members would not be here. That's not the will of their community, I would suggest. And I look forward to there being a more transparent process, a more certain process and a more sensible process with respect to dealing with postal votes at the next election in 2024.
Speaker.